Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling accounts recorded in the history of the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. In the manuscript collection of the Library of Congress, there exists a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, donated in 1923 by a family from Massachusetts. The letters were written between 1852 and 1867, chronicling events that transpired in Charleston, South Carolina, during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. Among these letters is one dated September 3rd, 1856, written by a schoolteacher named Abigail Morton to her sister in Boston. The letter describes an encounter that would change both women's lives. Today I met a young Negro girl, perhaps 14 years of age, who has accomplished what the law explicitly forbids and what many believe impossible. She has taught herself to read, not simple words, but complex texts. She reads with comprehension and hunger that surpasses many of my formally educated students. How she achieved this in a society that criminalizes such learning, I cannot fully fathom. But I have seen it with my own eyes, and I am forever changed by the encounter. The girl Abigail Morton described was named Phillis, though she would later be known by several names as her story unfolded. She was born in the spring of 1842 on a rice plantation called Oakwood, located in the low country region of South Carolina, approximately 30 miles from Charleston. The plantation encompassed nearly 1,500 acres of cultivated land, worked by more than 200 enslaved people who labored in the brutal conditions of rice cultivation, standing in water for hours, battling mosquitoes and disease, producing the crop that made their enslavers wealthy. According to plantation records preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, a notation from May 1842 reads, "Negro child born to the woman Judith, field hand, female, appears healthy." Named Phyllis. The entry is sparse, as was typical for enslaved births. There is no mention of a father, no celebration of the arrival of new life, only an accounting entry recording the increase of property. Phyllis entered the world as chattel, her value measured in future labor, her humanity denied from her first breath. The early years of Phyllis's life are poorly documented, existing only in fragmentary references in plantation ledgers and overseer reports. She lived with her mother Judith in the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins that housed the workforce. Until approximately age 6, she was not assigned regular work duties, spending her days in the relative freedom that very young enslaved children experienced before they were old enough to be economically exploited in systematic ways. A letter from the plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Whitfield, to his brother in Virginia, dated August 1847, provides a glimpse of conditions on the plantation. The rice harvest proceeds well this season, though we have lost several hands to fever. The climate here remains treacherous, and I fear we shall lose more before autumn ends. The Negroes in the quarters increase naturally, which is some compensation for those lost to disease. Among the children now reaching working age is a girl child of Judith's, quick and observant, who may prove useful in the house when she is somewhat older. The reference to Phyllis as quick and observant suggests that even at age 5, certain qualities of intelligence and awareness were noticeable to those who observed her. Whether these qualities were innate or developed through her particular experiences and circumstances is impossible to determine, but they would prove crucial to the remarkable path her life would take. In 1848, when Phyllis was approximately 6 years old, she was assigned her first regular duties. According to overseer records, she was placed in the children's work gang, performing tasks suitable for young workers, carrying water to field hands, collecting firewood, tending chickens, and helping with food preparation. These were the entry points into the world of enslaved labor, the beginning of a lifetime of exploitation that the system intended for her. But 1848 also brought an unexpected change that would alter Phillis's trajectory. Colonel Whitfield's daughter, Eleanor, then 15 years old, required a personal servant as she approached marriageable age. The selection of enslaved children to serve as companions and servants to white children was common practice in wealthy slaveholding families. These positions carried certain advantages: proximity to the main house, better food and clothing, less physically grueling work, but they also carried unique challenges and dangers, including closer surveillance and more intimate forms of control. Phillis was chosen for this role. A notation in the household accounts from November 1848 states, "The girl Phillis, daughter of Judith, assigned to attend Miss Eleanor, provided with house clothing and instructed in her duties." At 6 years old, Phillis was removed from her mother's daily care and moved into the main house, where she would sleep in a small room adjacent to Eleanor's chambers and be available to serve her young mistress at any hour. Eleanor Whitfield kept a diary during her teenage years, and this diary, preserved by her descendants and eventually donated to the College of Charleston archives, provides our most detailed window into Phillis's early life. An entry from December 1848 describes their initial relationship. "Father has given me a Negro girl named Phillis to attend to my needs. She is quite small, perhaps 6 years old, and seems frightened of everything in the house. I showed her how to lay out my clothing and brush my hair. She learns quickly, though she rarely speaks. I confess I find her silence unnerving. I wonder what thoughts pass through her mind, though I suppose Negroes do not think as we do." The final sentence of Eleanor's entry reflected the racist ideology that underpinned slavery, the belief that black people were intellectually inferior, incapable of the same depth of thought and feeling as white people. This belief was essential to maintaining the system, as it allowed slaveholders to reconcile their actions with their professed Christian values. If enslaved people were fully human, fully capable of thought and feeling, then slavery was indefensible. Therefore, their humanity had to be denied or diminished. But Phillis did think, did feel, did observe everything happening around her. Her silence was not evidence of limited capacity, but of survival strategy. In the main house, surrounded by white people who held absolute power over her, silence was safety. Speaking only when spoken to, revealing nothing of her interior life, watching and learning without appearing to do so, these were the skills that enslaved people developed to navigate their dangerous world. Over the next 2 years, Phillis served Eleanor faithfully, learning the routines and expectations of household service. She woke before Eleanor to prepare her clothing, attended her throughout the day, helped with dressing and grooming, and was available for any need or whim. It was exhausting work for a child, with no guaranteed rest and no freedom to decline. Yet, it also provided Phillis with something most enslaved children did not have: daily proximity to literacy. Eleanor was educated at home by a governess, as was customary for wealthy Southern girls. Her lessons took place in a sunny room on the second floor of the main house, filled with books, maps, and writing materials. Phillis was often present during these lessons, sitting quietly in a corner, ostensibly there in case Eleanor needed something, but effectively invisible to the adults who conducted the instruction. It was during these lessons that Phillis first encountered the written word in systematic ways. She watched as Eleanor learned her letters, practiced her penmanship, read aloud from primers and texts. She listened as the governess, Miss Harriet Pembroke, explained grammar, spelling, and composition. She observed the connection between the marks on paper and the sounds they represented, between written words and spoken language. An entry from Eleanor's diary, dated March 1850, contains a telling observation. "Today, during my lessons, I noticed Phillis watching intently as Miss Pembroke demonstrated how to form the letter A. When Miss Pembroke left the room briefly, Phillis reached out and traced the letter in the air with her finger, mimicking the motion she had seen. I laughed and told her Negroes cannot learn letters, that their minds are not made for such things. She said nothing, but returned to her corner. I wonder if she understood me. Eleanor's observation captures a crucial moment. Phillis was not merely present during lessons, but was actively trying to learn, attempting to absorb and practice what she witnessed. Eleanor's dismissal of this attempt reflected the prevailing belief in black intellectual inferiority, but it also revealed anxiety. If enslaved people could learn as white people did, then the entire justification for slavery collapsed. South Carolina law explicitly forbade teaching enslaved people to read or write. The Negro Act of 1740, strengthened after Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, made it illegal for anyone to teach enslaved people literacy, with substantial penalties for those who violated this prohibition. The law recognized what slaveholders knew instinctively: literacy was dangerous. A person who could read could access information beyond their master's control, could forge passes to travel, could read abolitionist literature, could communicate across distances. Literacy represented autonomy, and autonomy threatened slavery's foundation. But laws could not eliminate curiosity or intelligence. Enslaved people throughout the South found ways to learn despite legal prohibition and violent enforcement. Some were taught by sympathetic white people who violated the law secretly. Others learned from free black people who had gained literacy before restrictions tightened. Some taught themselves, piecing together knowledge from fragments of observation, from discarded newspapers, from signs and labels, from any source they could access. Phillis began her self-education through intense observation during Eleanor's lessons. Between 1850 and 1852, during the hours she spent in the schoolroom, she memorized the shapes of letters, the sounds they represented, the way they combined to form words. She could not practice openly. That would have been noticed and punished. Instead, she practiced in her mind, silently sounding out words, mentally tracing letters, building the architecture of literacy in private. An entry from Eleanor's diary, dated November 1851, suggests that Phillis's observation had not gone entirely unnoticed. Phillis has become rather bold in watching during my lessons. Today, when I was practicing my penmanship, she leaned forward to see better. Miss Pembroke noticed and scolded her sharply, saying a Negro girl has no business concerning herself with letters. Phillis apologized and returned to her corner, but I saw defiance in her eyes for just a moment before she lowered them. It troubles me, though I cannot say why. The defiance Eleanor detected was Phillis's determination to learn despite prohibition, her refusal to accept the limitations society imposed on her. This quiet resistance, invisible to most but occasionally glimpsed by observant witnesses, characterized enslaved people's daily navigation of oppression. They complied outwardly while maintaining interior autonomy, accepting conditions they could not change while rejecting the ideology that justified those conditions. In early 1852, when Phillis was approximately 10 years old, an incident occurred that would prove decisive. Colonel Whitfield received a shipment of books from Charleston, including several volumes he had ordered for his library. The books were unpacked in his study, and one, a worn copy of a children's primer, was deemed too damaged to shelve and was placed in a pile of items to be discarded or burned. Phillis, attending Eleanor, who had gone to the study to see the new books, noticed the primer in the discard pile. She said nothing, but her eyes fixed on it. Later that evening, when she had a few moments alone, she retrieved the primer from where it had been left and concealed it in her clothing. She took it to the small room where she slept and hid it beneath the thin pallet that served as her bed. This act was extraordinarily risky. If discovered with the book, Phillis would face severe punishment. Whipping, certainly. Possibly sail away from her mother, potentially worse. Enslaved people found with prohibited materials, especially materials related to literacy, were made examples of to deter others from similar aspirations. Yet Phillis took this risk because the primer represented something she desperately wanted: access to the written word. Over the following months, Phillis taught herself to read using the concealed primer. She could practice only in stolen moments. Late at night after Eleanor slept, early in the morning before the household stirred, during brief periods when she was left alone. She had no candle to read by, so she worked by moonlight or dawn's first light. She had no one to ask when she encountered difficulties, so she puzzled through problems on her own, making connections between the printed letters and the sounds she knew from spoken language. The primer, designed for young white children learning to read, contained alphabets, simple words, short sentences, and brief moral tales. Phillis memorized it systematically, page by page, testing herself to ensure comprehension. She compared the printed words with words she heard spoken, confirming her understanding of the connections. She practiced forming letters with her finger on the floor, memorizing their shapes and the order of strokes needed to create them. By late 1852, Phillis could read simple texts with reasonable fluency. She had accomplished what the law declared impossible, what her society insisted could not happen, what her enslavers believed she was incapable of achieving. She had taught herself to read, but reading the primer was not enough. Having tasted literacy, Phillis hungered for more. She needed access to other texts, to materials beyond the single book she had concealed. This presented enormous challenges. Books were carefully controlled in the Whitfield household. Their locations were known. Their absence would be noticed. Phillis could not simply take books from the library or from Eleanor's room without detection. Instead, she developed a different strategy. When she cleaned Colonel Whitfield's study, she would read passages from books that were left open on his desk, memorizing what she could in the few moments available before she had to move on to avoid suspicion. When Eleanor received letters from friends, Phillis would read them while laying out Eleanor's clothing, her eyes moving quickly over the text while her hands performed their expected tasks. When newspapers arrived, before they were read by the family, Phillis would glance at headlines and opening paragraphs while supposedly organizing them for presentation. Each of these acts represented a small theft of knowledge, a quiet insurrection against the system that declared her unworthy and incapable of learning. Phillis was stealing literacy piece by piece, word by word, building her understanding through fragments seized in brief and dangerous moments. An entry from Eleanor's diary, dated April 1853, captures an incident that revealed how far Phillis's abilities had developed. Today I received a letter from my cousin Charlotte in Richmond. I left it on my dressing table while I went to speak with Mother. When I returned, I found Phillis holding the letter, her eyes moving across the page. I demanded to know what she was doing. She said she was merely straightening the dressing table, but I am certain she was reading it. I told Father, who examined her. He asked if she knew her letters. She said no. He opened a book and pointed to a word, asking what it said. She claimed not to know. Father seemed satisfied, but I remained suspicious. Can Negroes truly learn to read? I thought it impossible, yet I would swear Phillis was reading my letter. Eleanor's suspicions were correct, but Phillis had successfully deflected the immediate danger by denying her abilities. This denial was both necessary for survival and psychologically costly. To possess knowledge and skill, yet be forced to pretend ignorance, to hide one's capabilities rather than develop them openly, to fear discovery of something that should be celebrated, this was the burden of literacy for enslaved people. Knowledge was power, but revealing that power brought danger. The incident prompted Colonel Whitfield to restrict Phillis's access to his study and to warn the household that written materials should not be left where servants might encounter them. But these precautions, while limiting Phillis's opportunities, could not eliminate them entirely. A household full of books could not completely prevent a determined person from accessing some of those books occasionally. Phillis continued her self-education, now with even greater caution. In the summer of 1853, a new source of reading material became available. Miss Harriet Pembroke, Eleanor's governess, completed her contract with the Whitfield family and prepared to leave for a new position. Before departing, she organized her teaching materials, discarding some books and papers that she deemed too worn or no longer needed. Among the discarded items was a small Bible with a broken binding. Phyllis, helping with the cleaning, discovered the Bible in the trash and quietly took it. This was an even greater treasure than the primaire. The Bible was the one book that enslaved people were sometimes permitted to access, as slaveholders believed it would make them more obedient. A servant found with a Bible might be punished for taking it without permission, but the punishment would likely be less severe than for possessing other books. Moreover, the Bible's content was vast, complex, and endlessly rich for someone learning to read with comprehension. Phyllis concealed the Bible with her primer and began working through it systematically. She started with the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life that were most familiar to her from sermons she had heard. She moved slowly, puzzling over words she did not know, inferring meaning from context, building her vocabulary and comprehension gradually. A letter from Colonel Whitfield to a fellow planter, dated November 1853, mentions an unexpected development. "I have noticed that the servant girl, Phyllis, who attends my daughter, has become notably quiet and withdrawn. When questioned, she claims nothing is amiss, but she spends every free moment in apparent meditation or prayer. My wife believes the girl has undergone a religious awakening, which if true would be welcome, as Christian Negroes are generally more tractable. I have permitted her to attend Sunday services with the other house servants, where she may receive proper instruction." What Colonel Whitfield interpreted as religious awakening was partially correct. Phyllis was indeed engaging deeply with Christian texts, but what he could not know was that her engagement came through reading the Bible herself, rather than merely hearing it preached. She was encountering Scripture directly, interpreting it through her own understanding, discovering passages that spoke to her experience as an enslaved person. She read the Exodus story of liberation from bondage. She read the prophets' denunciations of injustice and oppression. She read Jesus' proclamation that he came to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for prisoners, to set the oppressed free. She read Paul's assertion that in Christ there is neither slave nor free. She read these texts not as abstract theological concepts, but as words speaking directly to her condition, offering both comfort and challenge. Phyllis's literacy was transforming not only her intellectual capacities, but her spiritual and psychological understanding of herself and her circumstances. Reading gave her access to ideas and stories beyond what her enslavers wanted her to know. It provided alternative frameworks for understanding reality, for imagining possibility, for conceiving of herself as more than property. This is precisely why literacy was so feared and so prohibited. It enabled enslaved people to think independently, to question the narratives that justified their enslavement, to envision different futures. By 1854, when Phyllis was approximately 12 years old, her reading abilities had advanced substantially. She could read complex texts with good comprehension, could navigate unfamiliar material, and had developed a vocabulary that included words she had never heard spoken. She continued to read in secret, still concealing her abilities from the white family who owned her, still practicing the careful deception necessary for survival. In May 1854, an incident occurred that would lead to the most significant relationship of Phyllis's life. Colonel Whitfield hosted a dinner party for several prominent Charleston families. Among the guests was a widow named Margaret Ashford, who had recently moved to Charleston from Boston following her husband's death. Mrs. Ashford was an educated woman with abolitionist sympathies, though she kept these views largely private in Charleston's pro-slavery atmosphere. During the dinner, Mrs. Ashford required assistance, and Phyllis was sent to attend to her. While helping Mrs. Ashford in the guest room, Phillis noticed a book the widow had been reading. A volume of poetry by John Greenleaf Whittier, the abolitionist Quaker poet. The book lay open on a table, and Phyllis's eyes were drawn to the text. For just a moment, she forgot her training and her caution. She leaned slightly forward, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she read the opening lines of the visible poem. Mrs. Ashford noticed. A woman accustomed to observing subtle social cues, she recognized immediately what she was witnessing. She said nothing in the moment, allowing Phyllis to complete her assigned tasks. But after the girl left the room, Margaret Ashford sat in stunned contemplation of what she had seen. An enslaved child who could read, who had somehow acquired forbidden knowledge, who had achieved what the entire system was designed to prevent. A letter from Margaret Ashford to her sister in Boston, dated May 18, 1854, describes her reaction. Dear Sarah, I have witnessed something tonight that has shaken me to my core. At Colonel Whitfield's dinner, I was attended by a young Negro girl, perhaps 12 years old, who serves his daughter. Sarah, I am certain this child can read. I saw her eyes move across the page of my book with the unmistakable pattern of reading. When I caught her attention, she immediately looked away, fear evident in her expression. This means the child has somehow learned to read, despite it being strictly illegal, and despite certainly receiving no instruction. The courage and determination required to accomplish such learning in these circumstances defies imagination. I must find a way to speak with her privately, though I do not yet know how to manage it safely. Mrs. Ashford faced a moral dilemma. If she revealed what she had seen, Phyllis would face severe punishment. If she did nothing, a child with extraordinary abilities would remain trapped in ignorance, her gifts wasted. Mrs. Ashford decided on a careful course of action. She would cultivate friendship with the Whitfield family, visiting regularly, and through these visits she would find opportunities to assist Phyllis in expanding her education without exposing her to danger. Over the following months, Margaret Ashford became a frequent visitor to the Whitfield home. She brought books with her, leaving them in places where Phyllis might access them briefly while performing her duties. She engaged Phyllis in conversation when possible, speaking carefully but probing to assess the girl's understanding and knowledge. And gradually, through subtle signals and careful communication, she let Phyllis know that she was aware of her abilities and wished to help rather than harm. A diary entry from Mrs. Ashford, dated August 1854, describes progress. I have established beyond doubt that young Phyllis can read proficiently. Today I left a book of essays open to a passage about education. When I returned to the room, the book had been moved slightly, and I could see from Phyllis's expression that she had read it. Later, when we were alone for a moment, I asked her opinion on whether all people deserved education. She looked at me with fear and hope mingled in her eyes and said quietly, I believe learning is a gift from God that all should be permitted to receive. We said no more, but a connection has been established. I must proceed carefully, as both our positions are delicate, but I am determined to provide this remarkable child with materials and encouragement for her continued education. Through Mrs. Ashford's covert assistance, Phyllis gained access to a wider range of reading materials. The widow would bring books ostensibly for herself, but would leave them temporarily in places where Phyllis could reach them during her cleaning duties. She would engage Phyllis in brief conversations that allowed the girl to ask questions and discuss ideas without explicitly acknowledging her literacy. She became, in effect, Phyllis's secret tutor, guiding her education through indirect methods that avoided detection. The books Mrs. Ashford provided included works of history, philosophy, poetry, and geography. Phyllis read about ancient civilizations, about the American Revolution and its proclamations of liberty and equality, about other nations and cultures. She read Shakespeare and Milton, Wordsworth and Emerson. She encountered ideas about natural rights, human dignity, and moral justice. Each book expanded her understanding of the world beyond the plantation, challenged the narratives that justified her enslavement, and strengthened her sense of her own intellectual worth. By early 1856, when Phillis was approximately 14 years old, her education had reached a level that would have been impressive for any student, enslaved or free. She had taught herself not only to read, but to think critically, to analyze arguments, to synthesize information from multiple sources. She possessed knowledge that was supposed to be entirely inaccessible to someone in her position. It was during this period that the incident described in Abigail Morton's letter occurred. Miss Morton was a schoolteacher from Boston who had come to Charleston to visit her friend Margaret Ashford. During her visit in September 1856, Mrs. Ashford took the extraordinary risk of introducing her to Phillis and revealing the girl's abilities. Abigail Morton's letter to her sister continues beyond the passage quoted at the beginning of this account. Mrs. Ashford brought me to meet this remarkable girl in circumstances that ensured privacy and safety. She asked Phillis to demonstrate her reading. The child opened a volume of essays I had brought with me and read aloud with perfect fluency and evident comprehension. When I asked questions about the text, she answered with insight that demonstrated not merely literacy, but genuine understanding and analytical thinking. Sarah, I have taught in schools for a decade, and I can say with certainty that this enslaved child's intellectual abilities match or exceed those of many privileged students I have instructed. The injustice of her situation, the waste of her potential, the cruelty of a system that would deny her the right to develop her mind, all of this struck me with overwhelming force. I wept. Mrs. Ashford wept. Even Phillis wept, though she said it was from joy at being able to share her knowledge with sympathetic listeners after years of concealment. The meeting with Abigail Morton was transformative for Phillis. For the first time, she could openly discuss her reading with people who valued and encouraged it. She could ask questions freely, could express opinions, could be recognized as an intellectual being rather than as property. The experience confirmed for her that her secret learning was not foolish or vain, but valuable and meaningful. However, the meeting also reinforced the dangers of her situation. Abigail Morton's presence in Charleston was temporary. Margaret Ashford, while supportive, had to maintain her position in Charleston society and could not openly defy slavery's laws. Phillis remained enslaved, remained subject to Colonel Whitfield's absolute authority, remained constantly at risk of discovery and punishment. In late 1856, circumstances changed again. Eleanor Whitfield became engaged to a merchant from Savannah, Georgia, and would marry in the spring of 1857. As part of her marriage settlement, she would receive several enslaved people as property from her father. Phillis was to be among them, to continue serving Eleanor in her new home. The prospect of being taken to Savannah, away from her mother Judith, who still worked in the Oakwood plantation fields, away from Mrs. Ashford, who had become her mentor and protector, was devastating to Phillis. A letter from Margaret Ashford to her sister, dated December 1856, describes Phillis's anguish. The poor child is beside herself with grief. She faces separation from her mother, which alone is a terrible sorrow. But she also faces loss of the limited opportunities for reading that she has cultivated here. In Savannah, in a new household, closely watched as she learns new routines, she will have no access to books, no possibility of continuing her education. Everything she has worked so hard to achieve may be lost. I have been trying to devise some way to prevent this, but I see no legal or safe path forward. Mrs. Ashford considered several desperate options. She thought about attempting to purchase Phillis and then manumit her, but South Carolina law made manumission increasingly difficult and required freed black people to leave the state. She considered helping Phillis escape to the north, but such an attempt would be extraordinarily dangerous, and would likely result in severe punishment or death if discovered. She considered revealing Phillis's abilities to Colonel Whitfield and pleading for her educational opportunities, but this would almost certainly result in harsh punishment for the girl. In the end, events took an unexpected turn. In February 1857, Colonel Whitfield died suddenly of a heart condition. His death threw the household into turmoil and confusion. The estate had to be settled, debts paid, property distributed among heirs. Eleanor's wedding was postponed. And in the chaos of these changes, Margaret Ashford saw an opportunity. She approached Whitfield's widow with a carefully crafted proposal. She offered to purchase Phillis from the estate, explaining that she needed a household servant and had observed that the girl was well-trained and capable. She offered a fair market price, making the transaction attractive to an estate settling debts. Mrs. Whitfield, focused on managing the complex affairs of her late husband's property and preparing for her daughter's eventual wedding, agreed to the sale. On March 12, 1857, Phillis was legally transferred from the Whitfield estate to Margaret Ashford. The bill of sale, preserved in Charleston County records, describes one Negro girl named Phillis, approximately 15 years of age, skilled in household service, sold to Mrs. Margaret Ashford for the sum of $800. With this transaction, Phillis's life changed dramatically. Margaret Ashford's purchase of Phillis was motivated by the desire to protect the girl and foster her continued education, but it did not make Phillis free. Under South Carolina law, she remained enslaved, though now to a more sympathetic mistress. Mrs. Ashford could not legally manumit her without great difficulty, and even if she could, a freed black person in South Carolina faced severe restrictions and was required to leave the state within a year or be re-enslaved. Nevertheless, Phillis's circumstances improved significantly. In Mrs. Ashford's household, she was treated with respect and kindness. Her workload, while still substantial, was reasonable. Most importantly, she gained open access to Mrs. Ashford's extensive library and explicit permission to read and study. For the first time in her life, Phillis could read without fear or concealment. She could ask questions freely, could discuss what she learned, could develop her mind without risk of punishment. Mrs. Ashford guided her studies, suggesting books, explaining difficult concepts, engaging her in intellectual conversation. Phillis flourished in this environment, demonstrating just how much her earlier education had been constrained by the necessity of secrecy. A diary entry from Mrs. Ashford, dated July 1857, describes Phillis's progress. In just 4 months, Phillis has advanced astonishingly. She reads voraciously, often completing books in days. She writes with increasing skill, having never before had the opportunity to practice writing openly. She engages with complex philosophical and political texts, asking penetrating questions and forming thoughtful opinions. Yesterday we discussed Locke's theories of natural rights and social contract. Her analysis was sophisticated, and she immediately grasped the implications of such theories for the institution of slavery. She is beyond question one of the most intelligent and intellectually curious people I have ever known, and I'm convinced that with formal education she could achieve anything. The tragedy is that her talents will likely be wasted, her potential unfulfilled, because she was born black and enslaved in a society that cannot tolerate her brilliance. Mrs. Ashford's diary reveals both her admiration for Phillis and her recognition of the insurmountable barriers the girl faced. Phillis's intelligence and education, rather than guaranteeing her advancement, made her situation more poignant. She possessed abilities that would have opened every door for a white person, but that could only be exercised in secret, if at all, for someone in her position. In 1858, Mrs. Ashford made a decision that would define the final phase of Phillis's education. She began teaching Phillis not only to read, but to write essays and analyses. She gave her assignments, asked her to compose arguments on various topics, helped her develop her writing skills systematically. The purpose was both educational and practical. Mrs. Ashford was documenting Phillis's abilities, creating evidence of what an enslaved person could achieve intellectually when given opportunity. Over the course of 1858 and 1859, Phillis produced numerous essays on historical, philosophical, and literary topics. These essays, written in her own hand, demonstrated clear reasoning, sophisticated vocabulary, and analytical depth. Mrs. Ashford preserved these writings carefully, binding them into a small volume that she kept hidden. A letter from Mrs. Ashford to her sister in Boston, dated April 1859, explains her purpose. "I am collecting evidence of Phillis's intellectual achievements because I believe such evidence will be valuable someday. Perhaps not in my lifetime, but certainly in hers, slavery will end. When it does, there will be debates about the capacities of Negro people, about whether they deserve full citizenship and political rights. Phillis's writings will serve as proof that enslaved people possess the same intellectual capacities as whites, that lack of education, rather than lack of ability, explains any differences in achievement. Her essays demonstrate what black children could accomplish if given the same opportunities as white children. This documentation may seem like a small thing now, but I believe it will matter in the future." Mrs. Ashford's prescience was remarkable. She understood that the struggle over slavery was also a struggle over beliefs about black humanity and capacity, and that evidence contradicting racist assumptions would be valuable in that struggle. Phillis's writings became, in effect, her testimony, silent witness to intellectual abilities that the slave system insisted could not exist. The years 1859 through 1861 saw increasing sectional tensions as the nation moved toward civil war. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 led to South Carolina's secession in December, followed by the formation of the Confederacy and the outbreak of war in April 1861. Charleston, as a major southern port and the place where the first shots of the war were fired, became a central location in the conflict. For Phillis and Mrs. Ashford, the war years brought danger, deprivation, and uncertainty. As a northern woman with known abolitionist sympathies, Mrs. Ashford fell under suspicion in Confederate Charleston. She was watched, her movements monitored, her correspondence examined. She had to be extremely careful not to provide evidence that could be used against her. Phillis, meanwhile, navigated the complex position of being enslaved to someone who opposed slavery, living in a city fighting to preserve slavery, while the war that might end slavery raged around them. She continued her reading and studying, though with necessary caution given the heightened tensions and surveillance. A diary entry from Mrs. Ashford, dated June 1862, describes their situation. "The city is under blockade, food is becoming scarce, and everyone is on edge. My northern origins make me suspect, and I must be careful in all I say and do. Phillis and I continue our private intellectual work, but we are circumspect about it. She reads newspapers avidly, following the war's progress with keen interest. We discuss what various outcomes might mean for enslaved people, though we must be cautious even in the privacy of my home. Phillis's hope for emancipation is palpable, but so is her fear of what might come if the Confederacy prevails. We are living in suspended time, waiting to see which future will emerge." As the war continued and Union victories accumulated, the possibility of slavery's end became more real. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in January 1863, declared that enslaved people in Confederate territory were free, though it could not immediately be enforced in areas still under Confederate control. Nevertheless, the proclamation signaled that Union victory would mean slavery's end. On February 18, 1865, Union forces entered Charleston, and the city fell to federal control. The Confederacy was collapsing, and slavery's end was now inevitable. For Phyllis, then approximately 23 years old, the moment she had read about, hoped for, and hardly dared to believe would come, had arrived. She was free. A letter from Mrs. Ashford to her sister, dated February 25, 1865, describes Phyllis's reaction. Slavery has ended here. When Phyllis learned that she was legally free, she wept, not tears of wild celebration, but quiet tears of relief and gratitude. She said she had prayed for this day since she first learned to read and understood the injustice of her condition. Later, we spoke about her future. I have told her she is welcome to remain in my household as a paid employee if she wishes, or she is free to leave and pursue whatever path she chooses. She says she needs time to consider what freedom means and what she wants to do with it. The transition from slavery to freedom, while joyous, was also complex and challenging. Phyllis had to navigate questions that most newly freed people faced: how to support herself economically, where to live, how to exercise rights she had never possessed. For Phyllis, these questions were complicated by her unusual educational background. She possessed knowledge and skills that could potentially open opportunities, but she also faced all the barriers that confronted black women in the post-war South. She decided to remain in Charleston and to dedicate herself to education. Having experienced firsthand the transformative power of literacy, having struggled to learn in secret and at great risk, she was determined to ensure that other black children and adults would have the opportunities she had been denied for so long. In the fall of 1865, Phyllis began teaching in one of the freedmen's schools that were being established throughout the South by Northern missionary societies and the Freedmen's Bureau. These schools provided basic education to formerly enslaved people, both children and adults, many of whom had been forbidden to learn throughout their lives and who hungered for literacy with an intensity that moved their teachers. A report from the American Missionary Association, dated December 1865, mentions Phyllis's work. Among our teachers in Charleston is a remarkable young woman, herself formerly enslaved, who demonstrates unusual skill and dedication in her work. Miss Phyllis, surname unknown as many freed people are still determining names for themselves, teaches with both competence and passion. Her students report that she understands their struggles and their eagerness to learn in ways that make her especially effective. She has expressed interest in obtaining more advanced education herself so that she might teach at higher levels. Phyllis's desire for continued education led her to contact Abigail Morton, the teacher who had met her in 1856 and who had returned to Boston after that visit. A letter from Phyllis to Miss Morton, dated March 1866, one of the first letters Phyllis wrote as a free woman, expresses her hopes. Dear Miss Morton, you may remember meeting me nearly 10 years ago through Mrs. Ashford's kindness. I am the girl who taught herself to read in slavery. I write now to inform you that I am free and working as a teacher in Charleston, seeking to provide others with the education I was so long denied. I write also to ask if you know of opportunities for me to further my own education. I wish to learn more so that I might teach more effectively. I do not know what is possible for someone like me, but I am determined to try. With gratitude for your past kindness and hope for your continued assistance, I remain your servant, Phillis Grant. The surname Grant was Phyllis's chosen name after emancipation, taken from Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who had led federal forces to victory. Like many formerly enslaved people, Phyllis used her freedom to name herself, choosing an identity rather than accepting one imposed by enslavers. Abigail Morton responded enthusiastically, and over the following months she worked to help arrange for Phyllis to come north for further education. In September 1866, Phyllis traveled to Boston, the first time she had ever left South Carolina, the first time she had experienced a society where slavery had been abolished decades earlier, where black people had more rights and opportunities, where her intelligence and education might be more fully recognized. She enrolled in a normal school, an institution that trained teachers, where she studied pedagogy, advanced literature, mathematics, science, and history. A letter from one of her professors at the normal school, dated November 1866, describes her as a student. Miss Grant is among the most serious and dedicated students I have encountered. She brings to her studies an intensity born of having been denied education for so long. She works harder than necessary, reads more than assigned, asks questions that probe deeply into every subject. Her written work demonstrates clarity of thought and expression that equals or exceeds that of students who have had far more formal schooling. She is living proof that enslaved people's lack of education reflected lack of opportunity, not lack of capacity. Phillis completed the normal school program in 1868, graduating with honors. She could have remained in the North, where opportunities were greater and where her abilities might be more fully utilized. But she chose to return to the South, specifically to South Carolina, to teach in the communities that most needed education. A letter explaining her decision, written to Abigail Morton in May 1868, states, "I am grateful for all that Boston has given me, education, opportunity, affirmation of my abilities, but my people are in the South, facing enormous challenges as they navigate freedom. They need teachers who understand their experiences, who share their history, who can inspire them with examples of what education can achieve. I was enslaved for 23 years. I learned to read in secret, at great risk. I know what literacy meant to me. It was power. It was dignity. It was access to ideas that transformed my understanding of myself and my world. I must return to share that gift with others who have been denied it as I was." Phillis returned to Charleston in July 1868 and established a school for black children. The school, which she called the Grant School for Colored Children, operated in a small building she rented with her savings and with donations from Northern supporters. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and moral philosophy to students ranging from age 5 to adult learners who attended evening classes. Records from the Freedmen's Bureau and from missionary societies describe the school's success. Student enrollment grew steadily. Former students testified to Phillis's effectiveness as a teacher and to the transformation education brought to their lives. The school gained a reputation for excellence, and Phillis gained recognition as an educator of unusual skill and dedication. A newspaper article from the Charleston Daily News, dated September 1870, profiles Phillis and her school. Among the educational institutions serving the colored population of Charleston, few are more successful than the school operated by Miss Phillis Grant. Miss Grant herself has a remarkable history. Born into slavery, self-educated in secret before emancipation, formally trained in the North after freedom came, she returned to Charleston to dedicate herself to educating her people. Her students speak of her with admiration and affection, and the progress they demonstrate reflects her skill as an instructor. While questions about Negro education remain controversial in some quarters, Miss Grant's work demonstrates that properly taught colored children can achieve substantial academic progress. The article's language reflected the racism of the era, the patronizing reference to colored people, the suggestion that black intellectual capacity was controversial, but it also documented Phillis's success and growing reputation. She was becoming known not just locally, but throughout the region as an example of what formerly enslaved people could achieve and what black teachers could accomplish. Phillis continued teaching in Charleston through the 1870s and into the 1880s. She trained numerous students who themselves became teachers, multiplying her impact. She advocated for public funding for black education, though with limited success as Reconstruction collapsed and white supremacy reasserted control. She wrote articles and essays about education, though most were published in small black newspapers rather than in mainstream outlets. Throughout these years, she also maintained the practice that had begun in secret during her enslavement: reading. She continued to educate herself, to engage with new ideas, to expand her knowledge. Her personal library grew to include hundreds of volumes. She corresponded with educators and intellectuals, both black and white, discussing educational philosophy and practice. A letter from Phillis to Margaret Ashford, written in 1875, reflects on her journey. Dear Mrs. Ashford, I write to thank you once again for the gift you gave me so many years ago, not just the gift of books and encouragement, but the gift of affirming that my desire to learn was valid and worthy. I think often of those days when I had to hide my reading, when literacy was forbidden fruit I stole in secret moments. Now I spend every day teaching others to read, giving them openly what I had to take furtively. The power of reading remains as profound as I knew it would be. When someone learns to read, they gain not just a skill, but a key to knowledge, to ideas, to understanding their world and imagining alternatives. Every student who learns to read in my school experiences something of what I experienced when I first decoded those marks on paper and realized they carried meaning. I am grateful beyond words that I can give this gift freely now, that I can watch literacy transform lives without fear of punishment. This is the freedom I dreamed of, not just personal liberty, but the freedom to share knowledge, to lift others, to be fully who I am, without concealment. In 1882, Phillis married a minister named Samuel Washington, himself formerly enslaved and now leading a church in Charleston. They had 2 daughters whom Phillis educated personally, ensuring they had the opportunities she had been denied. The daughters both became teachers themselves, continuing their mother's legacy. Phillis continued teaching until 1895, when declining health forced her to retire. She was approximately 53 years old, but had been weakened by decades of hard work and the lingering effects of malnutrition and disease from her years in slavery. She spent her final years living with her daughters, reading, writing occasional essays, and receiving visits from former students who came to pay respects to their beloved teacher. She died on February 14, 1898, at approximately 56 years old. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, students, teachers, community members who testified to her impact on their lives. She was buried in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery, in a section that by then permitted black burials, her grave marked with a stone bearing the inscription, Phillis Grant, 1842-1898. She discovered the power of reading and shared it with her people. The volume of Phillis's essays that Mrs. Ashford had compiled, documenting her intellectual abilities while still enslaved, was eventually donated to the Library of Congress, where it remains today. The essays stand as testament to what she achieved despite every obstacle, to the intellectual abilities that slavery sought to deny and suppress, to the hunger for knowledge that prohibition could not eliminate. In the decades following her death, Phillis's story was preserved primarily in oral tradition among Charleston's black community. Former students told their children and grandchildren about the teacher who had taught herself to read in slavery, who had risked punishment to gain knowledge, who had dedicated her free life to educating others. The story took on legendary qualities, with some details embellished and others forgotten, but the essential narrative persisted. The rediscovery of Phillis's story by historians began in the early 20th century, when researchers studying education during Reconstruction found references to her school and her work. The letters between her and Abigail Morton, between her and Mrs. Ashford, provided rich documentation. Eleanor Whitfield's diary, discovered decades after her death, provided insights into Phillis's childhood and her secret learning. Gradually, historians pieced together a comprehensive account of her remarkable life. What emerges from this historical record is the story of a person of extraordinary intelligence, determination, and courage. Born into a system designed to keep her ignorant and powerless, Phillis refused to accept those limitations. At tremendous risk, she taught herself to read, gaining access to knowledge that transformed her understanding of herself and her world. She then dedicated her life to ensuring that others would not face the barriers she had encountered, that literacy would be available freely rather than having to be stolen in secret. Phillis's story is significant for multiple reasons. First, it demonstrates that enslaved people's lack of education reflected lack of opportunity rather than lack of ability. When given access to learning, even in the most difficult circumstances, enslaved people could achieve at high levels. Second, it reveals the extraordinary courage and determination required to learn in a system that criminalized such learning. Phillis risked severe punishment every time she opened a book, yet she persisted because she understood that knowledge was worth the risk. Third, it shows how literacy functioned as a form of resistance and liberation. By learning to read, Phillis claimed power that slavery sought to deny her. She accessed ideas and information beyond her enslaver's control. She developed intellectual capacities that contradicted the ideology that justified her enslavement. Fourth, it illustrates the crucial role that educated black people played in the post-emancipation period. Phillis's dedication to teaching other formerly enslaved people helped build the institutions and spread the literacy that would be essential for black advancement in subsequent generations. Phillis's story also raises important questions about the relationship between individual achievement and systemic injustice. Her success in teaching herself to read was remarkable, but it required exceptional abilities, extraordinary circumstances, and considerable luck. Most enslaved people did not have access to books, did not have literate people willing to help them secretly, did not have the cognitive abilities or personality traits that made Phillis's self-education possible. Should we celebrate Phillis's achievement while recognizing that her exceptionality highlights rather than minimizes the injustice of a system that denied education to millions? The answer must be yes to both. We can and should honor Phillis's remarkable accomplishments, while also recognizing that her story underscores the tragedy of all the potential that slavery destroyed. For every Phillis who managed to educate herself despite prohibition, how many other intelligent, curious, capable people were prevented from developing their abilities? How many would-be scholars, writers, scientists, and teachers lived and died in slavery without ever learning to read? How much collective knowledge and creativity was lost because a system built on exploitation required keeping people ignorant? These questions are not merely historical. The legacy of slavery's denial of education persisted long after emancipation. Jim Crow segregation systematically underfunded black schools. Discriminatory practices limited black access to higher education. The effects of these historical injustices continue to shape educational opportunities and outcomes today. Phillis's story reminds us that educational inequality is not natural or inevitable, but is the product of deliberate policies and practices designed to maintain racial hierarchy. For contemporary black Americans, Phillis's story serves as an inspiration and a reminder. It inspires by demonstrating the hunger for learning, the determination to overcome obstacles, and the commitment to using education to lift the community that characterized many formerly enslaved people. It reminds by showing the high cost of educational denial and the importance of ensuring that every child, regardless of race or circumstances, has access to quality education. The story's title, The Talented Slave Girl Who Discovered the Power of Reading, Every Black Person Must Know, reflects the conviction that this history should be widely known within the black community and beyond. Stories like Phillis's are part of a heritage of resistance, achievement, and commitment to progress that deserve recognition and celebration. They counter narratives that minimize black intellectual contributions or suggest that educational inequality reflects ability rather than opportunity. They provide models of courage and dedication for contemporary students facing their own challenges. Phillis discovered the power of reading in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. She learned that literacy was not merely a technical skill, but a transformative force. It changed how she understood herself, how she interpreted her world, what she could imagine as possible. She learned that knowledge was power, that ideas could not be physically confined even when bodies were enslaved, that intellectual freedom preceded and enabled physical freedom. Having discovered this power, she dedicated her life to sharing it. She became a teacher because she understood that education was the key to liberation, that literacy would be essential for formerly enslaved people to claim full citizenship and opportunity, that knowledge shared multiplied rather than diminished. She understood that her personal achievement meant little if it remained isolated, that it gained meaning through being transmitted to others, through lifting her community as she herself had been lifted. This commitment to education as collective liberation rather than merely personal advancement characterized many black educators in the post-emancipation period. They understood that their people's progress depended on widespread literacy and education. They worked tirelessly, often in difficult circumstances with inadequate resources, to build schools and teach students. They believed in education as a tool for racial uplift, as a means of claiming rights and opportunities that had been denied, as a way of proving the lie of claims about black inferiority. Phillis Grant was one among thousands of such educators, most of whose names are unknown. But her story survives in unusual detail, allowing us to understand not just what she accomplished, but how she accomplished it. Not just her public achievements, but her private struggles. Not just her work as a teacher, but her formation as a learner. Her story gives us insight into the inner life of resistance, into the courage required to claim forbidden knowledge, into the power of literacy to transform consciousness. In an era when literacy is nearly universal in developed nations, when most people learn to read as young children through formal instruction, it is difficult to fully grasp what literacy meant to someone like Phillis. It was not just a skill, but a form of freedom. It was not just useful, but transformative. It was not just valuable, but worth risking everything to obtain. Understanding this significance helps us appreciate why education was so fiercely prohibited under slavery and so fiercely pursued after emancipation. It was never just about reading and writing. It was about power, dignity, and self-determination. Phillis's story is ultimately about the indomitable human spirit, about the capacity to maintain hope and strive for growth even in circumstances designed to crush such aspirations. She was born into slavery, forbidden to learn, denied every opportunity that her intelligence and curiosity merited. Yet she found a way. She taught herself. She claimed knowledge that was supposed to be beyond her reach, and having gained it, she shared it, ensuring that others would benefit from her hard-won wisdom. This is why every black person should know her story, and why every person, regardless of race, should know it. It is a story about the costs of oppression and the power of resistance. It is a story about what education means and why it matters. It is a story about one remarkable woman and about the countless others whose stories will never be known. It is a story that challenges, inspires, and demands reflection on the relationship between knowledge and freedom, between individual achievement and collective progress, between past injustices and present responsibilities. Phillis Grant discovered the power of reading. In doing so, she changed not only her own life, but the lives of hundreds of students she taught, and through them, the lives of subsequent generations. Her legacy lives on in every person who values education, who understands its transformative potential, who commits to ensuring that all children have access to the learning that was denied to so many for so long. If this narrative has moved you to reflection about education, literacy, courage, and the long struggle for justice and opportunity, I invite you to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments about what Phillis's story means to you, and subscribe to this channel for more accounts that honor the resistance, achievement, and resilience of those who overcame seemingly insurmountable obstacles to claim knowledge, dignity, and freedom.